If you're trying to break into project management and you keep seeing entry-level PM jobs that require 2 or 3 years of experience, this video is for you. Because if you misunderstand why that requirement exists in the first place, you'll waste months, sometimes years, doing the wrong thing, the wrong kind of prep, stacking credentials, and still getting rejected. By the end of this video, you'll understand what hiring managers are actually screening for, why certifications alone don't fix it, and what kind of experience actually changes the outcome. And this matters right now because the PM market is tighter than it used to be. Fewer roles, more applicants, and a lot less patience for on-the-job training. Now, let's clear something up first. When people see these types of job postings, they assume one of two things. Either companies are being unrealistic or they're gatekeeping entry-level roles on purpose. That's not what's happening. That experience required line is not about seniority, it's about risk. Here's what that looks like in real life. A hiring manager isn't posting that role because everything is calm and under control in the company. They're hiring because a project might be slipping or a delivery went sideways or a stakeholder escalated hard enough that leadership noticed and now they need some help. So now they're scanning resumes with one question in the back of their mind: who is least likely to make this thing worse? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Companies don't experience lack of knowledge as pain. They experience bad decisions as pain. I've spent years in IT project environments, migrations, rollout, infrastructure changes, and I've seen this pattern repeatedly. Projects don't fail because someone didn't know a framework. They fail because someone hesitated when things got unclear. So let me give you a very normal moment inside of projects. You're 2 weeks from a release, QA flags a late risk. A dependency is behind. Someone asks, do we delay the release, or do we cut scope, or do we accept the risk? That question doesn't go to the most certified person in the room. It goes to the person who owns the call. Now think about the last time a company let a truly inexperienced PM sit in that seat. They stalled. They tried to get consensus. They waited for more information. That never came. 2 weeks later, leadership is angry and out of options. That memory will stick with you. So when you see entry-level PMs with experience required, what they're really saying is, we don't want to be the training ground for someone's first hard decision. This does not mean that you need 10 years of experience, and it does not mean that the system is fair or well explained. It means that most people are preparing for PM roles as if they're knowledge-only roles, when in reality, they're ownership roles. And that misunderstanding is what keeps people stuck. Most roles start as learning roles. Project management does not. If you're an analyst or a coordinator or even a junior engineer, your early mistakes are usually contained. Someone reviews your work, someone else owns the final call. If something goes wrong, it's uncomfortable, but it's rarely visible outside of your immediate team. Project management isn't structured that way. From day one, the PM role exists to own outcomes, not just contribute effort. Even when the title says junior or entry level, the expectations don't shrink nearly as much as people assume. That's why companies struggle to treat PM like a true apprenticeship role. So let me make this concrete for you. Let's say you're in a stand-up. A developer says, hey, if we keep this feature, the timeline will slip. QA says, if we cut it, the risk is gonna go up. Stakeholders say, hey, we already told leadership that this was included. Now everyone turns and looks at one person. That moment doesn't care how entry level you are. In that moment, the company isn't asking you, hey, do you know Scrum? They're asking, can you make a call with incomplete information and live with it? This is the core difference. Our project management sits at the intersection of time, scope, people, and risk. And when those collide, someone has to decide. Not recommend, not research, decide. That's why learning PM theory feels so misleading to a lot of people, because theory makes it sound like the job is mostly process. In reality, process is the easy part. The hard part is the judgment that comes when you're in the role. And judgment doesn't come from watching videos or memorizing templates. It comes from being in situations where there isn't a clean answer and realizing that not deciding is also a decision, usually the worst one. This is also why hiring managers hesitate with true beginners. They're not worried you'll forget a step in a framework. They're worried about what you'll do when two reasonable options both have downsides. And to be clear, this does not mean you need to already be perfect at this. It means the role assumes you've already felt the discomfort of ownership at least once. That's why project management doesn't behave like other entry-level jobs, because the cost of indecision shows up fast and it shows up very loudly. Most people trying to break into project management are preparing as if they're applying for a knowledge role. They're polishing definitions, they're stacking certifications, and hoping someone gives them a chance. But companies aren't looking for proof that you studied. They're looking for signals that you won't freeze when the room goes quiet and everyone is waiting for you to speak. Here's where things usually click for most people. When hiring managers interview for PM roles, they're not actually testing whether you know project management. They're testing whether you can think like someone who's been burned before. That might sound a little harsh, but it's accurate. Or most interviews don't fall apart on the first question. They fall apart on the second or third follow-up. You answer something like, hey, I made sure stakeholders were aligned, and the interview says, okay, how? So you explain the meeting, then they ask you, okay, what happened when they didn't agree? That's the moment. People who have only theoretical exposure usually shift their tone right there, and they start generalizing. They start saying things like, oh, in that case I would, or best practices. Hiring managers notice that immediately, because when someone has real experience, they don't answer that way. They say things like, oh, we had two options, neither was great, here's what we chose, here's what we accepted as a risk. And they don't sound confident because they memorized something. They sound confident and calm because they've already lived through that uncertainty before. That's the signal. That's what hiring managers are really screening for. It's that judgment under ambiguity. Can you explain why a decision was made without pretending it was perfect? Can you describe trade-offs without getting defensive? Can you talk about things that didn't go cleanly without sounding lost? So let me give you a very common interview moment. The interviewer might ask you, hey, tell me about a time that a project didn't go as planned. A theoretical answer sounds polished but shallow. It stays high level. It avoids specifics. It focuses on effort, not on consequence. And an experienced answer sounds different. It talks about timing. It talks about constraints. It talks about what information was missing at the time and why the decision still had to be made. Hiring managers aren't expecting hero stories. They're listening for structure. They want to hear how you think when there isn't a rule book. This is why certifications alone don't move the needle the way people expect. Certifications prove exposure to language, but they don't prove exposure to consequences. And in project management roles or PM roles, consequences is everything. When something slips, leaders don't ask, hey, did the PM know the framework? They ask, why didn't we see this coming and what are we doing now? So when companies say they want experience, what they actually want is proof that you've already been in the middle of uncomfortable situations where information is incomplete, expectations conflict, and waiting feels safer than deciding. That's the bar. And once you see that clearly, the whole problem reframes itself, because the question starts being, how do I learn more project management? And it becomes, how do I get close enough to real decisions that I can talk about them honestly in interviews? So most people trying to break into project management are solving for the wrong problem. They assume the gap between where they are and a PM role is more knowledge. So they study, they take another course, they get another certification. But when you watch interviews closely, that's not where things break. The real gap is not skill, it's exposure. Let me explain what that means in practice. A lot of people already have project experience. They've helped on initiatives, they've coordinated work, they've followed up with teams, they've even run parts of projects informally. But those experiences usually have four missing elements. The first one is end-to-end exposure. Most people only see a slice of the project. They're involved during execution or during planning, but never watched a project move from initiation through closeout. So when they talk about their experience, it sounds fragmented. There's no life cycle to the entire story. Second is decision ownership. They contributed input, but they weren't the ones who had to make the call. They could advise, they could suggest, but someone else had to absorb the risk. That changes how you think. And then thirdly is consequence awareness. When you don't own the decision, you don't feel the downstream impact. You don't get the email 2 weeks later when something breaks. You don't sit in the review explaining why a trade-off was accepted. Without that, answers always stay theoretical. And number four is PM language. And I'm not talking about buzzwords. I'm talking about the ability to explain work in terms of risks and dependencies and constraints and outcomes instead of tasks and effort. Here's a very common micro situation. Let's say we have two candidates that did almost the same work. One says, I helped coordinate the rollout and supported the team. The other says, I own the rollout timeline, flagged a dependency risk late, and recommended pushing one feature to protect the launch date. Same work, completely different signal that goes to the hiring manager. The difference isn't confidence or intelligence, it's proximity to ownership. This is why people can work hard for years and still feel blocked. They're busy, but they're buffered from consequences, and without consequences, experience doesn't register as experience to a hiring manager. And this is important because none of this means that you're incapable. It just means that you haven't been placed or placed yourself close enough to the decision line yet. Once you understand that, the path forward becomes much clearer, because now the goal isn't learn more project management, it's get closer to real decisions in a legitimate way. So this is the part people either overcomplicate or try to shortcut. You do not need to lie about your title on your resume. You do not need to wait for someone to magically promote you to get experience as a project manager. You definitely don't need to pretend you ran projects that you didn't run. What you do need is a legitimate way to get proximity to ownership. Here are a few ways that actually work in real environments. First, look for work inside the organization that could be considered a project. Most organizations constantly have work that isn't formally staffed with a PM. A rollout, maybe a process change, maybe a system upgrade, maybe a pilot. These are the best entry points because leadership cares about the outcomes, not the title. The mistake people make is helping around the work instead of stepping into it. There's a big difference between saying, hey, let me know how I can help, and saying, hey, I can own coordination for this and keep everyone aligned on dates and risks. Same effort, just completely different signal that you're giving off. Second, start owning decisions and stop asking for permission for everything. Ownership doesn't mean being reckless. It means framing options and making recommendations with a clear rationale. So here's a normal example. Let's say a dependency is late. You see it early in your project. Instead of just flagging it and waiting, you come back with, hey, we can either push this task out and protect the launch, or we can keep it and accept the testing risks that will be involved. And I recommend option X because of Y. Even if leadership overrides your decision, you're still practicing judgment and you're now able to talk about it in real interviews. Third is learn to reframe the work that you're already doing. A lot of people are doing PM adjacent work, but describing it like an admin. They say things like, I followed up with the team, instead of, I tracked dependencies across teams and escalated risks when dates conflicted. Again, same work, just different framing. This, again, is very important for how you frame things on the resume, because this is what hiring manager recruiters are going to be looking for. Fourth is get exposure to the full life cycle thinking, even if you own only a slice of the pie. So if you're brought in mid-execution, ask how the project was initiated, ask what constraints were set early, ask how success will be measured at closeout. You don't need authority to understand the life cycle, but understanding it changes how you operate. Now here's what this does not mean. It does not mean grabbing work and burning yourself out. It does not mean doing unpaid labor endlessly. It does not mean pretending that casual coordination equals real PM experience. The goal is controlled exposure, enough ownership to feel consequence, but in an environment where mistakes are survivable. And this is where most people get stuck, because while these paths exist, they're inconsistent. They depend on timing, managers, and luck. And some people get great exposure early on, others stay buffered for years. That's why people look for structured ways to practice ownership before the job. At this point, the pattern should be pretty clear. Companies aren't asking for experience because they want to exclude you. They're asking because they don't want someone's first exposure to ownership happen on a live project with real consequences. And that creates a frustrating gap. You need experience to get the job, but you need the job to get experience. Some people close that gap through timing or a supportive manager, but a lot of people don't. They stay buffered in adjacent roles, doing good work, but never quite close enough to the decision line to build the kind of experience hiring managers actually respond to. This is where a structured environment matters a lot. And so that's the idea behind the Eddy System Live PMO. You practice a job before you're hired for it, without pretending, without exaggerating or shortcutting the process. It's not a course, it's not a certification prep, it's not a promise of a job. It's simply a place where you can step inside a realistic PMO environment and operate the way real project managers do. That means defined roles, real project context, stakeholders, constraints, risks, and phase gates. You're not told what the right answer is. You're required to make decisions, explain them, defend them, and adjust when feedback comes. Here's why that matters. Remember what hiring managers are actually screening for. They're looking for judgment, they're looking for structure, they're looking for calm thinking under pressure. Those things don't come from watching someone else manage a project. They come from being the person who has to answer questions like, hey, why did you choose that option? Or what risk did you accept here? Or what would you do differently next time? Inside a live PMO, you get to build those muscles in a safe but realistic environment. Mistakes are allowed, but they're examined. Decisions have consequences, but they're survivable. And over time, your answers stop sounding theoretical because they're not. That's the difference. People who come out of that environment don't magically become senior PMs, but they stop sounding like beginners. They can walk through a project lifecycle. They can talk about trade-offs. They can handle follow-up questions without stalling. And that's what changes interviews. Not because someone gave them a title, but because they've already operated in that function. So when you see entry-level PM requires experience, read it correctly. It doesn't mean go collect more credentials. It means show me you've carried responsibility. There are multiple ways to earn that experience. Some are informal, some are opportunistic, some are structured. The important part is this: experience isn't something you wait to be given, it's something you deliberately put yourself close enough to earn. That's the real reason entry-level PM roles require experience. And once you understand that, the path forward stops being confusing and starts being intentional. Hopefully now you understand why entry-level roles require experience. If you're interested in building real IT project management experience yourself, I invite you to join our live PMO and build that experience and build that confidence before you step into your next live interview. If nothing else, like and subscribe to this video, and I'll see you on the next one.